I don't know if you have a similar experience. One day you will suddenly find, I have believed for many years, actually wrong. Think back carefully, self at that time, with almost no evidence at all. They took a confident attitude. In fact, this situation is not a mistake. It is the thinking mechanism of the human brain. He made us very sloppy, made a lot of seemingly solid arguments. Let's chat together today. How do humans make decisions? And what is a true argument? Hello, I am Plato Stone. Welcome to Leather Thinking, the second installment of the series. In order to facilitate everyone's understanding, I will briefly introduce the content of the video. The structure can be customized according to your preferences. Jump to the corresponding section. First, in the first part, let's look at the human mind. That's what I call input, information processing, judgment evaluation, decision-making behavior, the 5 stages of original thinking and self-correction, corresponding theoretical support. I will also reflect in the process of explaining, and the second part of the video. It's the heart of our entire video. How to build the right argument. The content of this time, I will try to disrupt the traditional college during education. The course. That kind of chapter. The concept of heap system. We're no longer here to instill jargon, but back to the most authentic approach of philosophy. And we looked at it through a continuous set of debate scenarios. A Socratic inquiry. I'll refer to Bratu's form in the dialogues. Put specific knowledge. It's embedded in the real debate. Of course, where it needs to be explained. I will also insert concise and clear explanations. Help everyone clarify the logical definition and the theoretical key techniques. Language. This section will deal with the definition of argument, the structure and logical form of argumentation, types of argumentation and inference errors, ethical dimension, reasoning and realistic conflict. Okay, cut the crap. Let's start this philosophical debate. Journey. We often think that human decision-making is a rational process. But the truth of the matter is, our brain is more like a computer, energy-efficient processor. He's extremely good at opportunism, lazy or even lie to us. So that every time we look in the mirror, we'll feel good about themselves. When you open the front-facing camera of your phone, we are deceived by our brains. Below, I will base my understanding of contemporary cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and philosophy. Put the human thought process, simply broken down into 5 key stages. Information input is the starting point of the human thought process. We're born with sight, hearing, touch, and other senses to receive information from the outside world. But our brains don't take everything on board. We use our attention. Simple filtering and filtering of this information. That might not be easy to understand, but I believe many people have the experience of looking for a mobile phone in the process. The presence of mobile phones, overwritten by the behavior diagrams we operate on, the brain temporarily blocked his identity as the target. So, it's not the eyes that determine what we can see. It's our attention. Psychologist Donald Broadbent. A filtering model was proposed in 1958. He thinks our brains can only process very small amount of information. Most of the rest is in the brain, unconsciously ruled out. In the stage of information processing, the brain only keeps the information he deems important, and the judgment itself that it matters. You fall into conviction, cultural background, the various effects of emotional state. So the world as we see it, it's not a perceived consequence. It's a kind of tailoring. The brain is not a camera. It's because of the director who picks the key points. What you see is not all that is in front of you. It's the part of reality that you default to that matters. The self you see is the self you want to see. This would also explain why is there a self in the mirror. Moments have a self. And the front-facing camera of the phone, another self. Information entering our brain. It's not static. It enters the stage of cognitive processing. The brain right now is like an editorial office. He is leveraging past experience. Compare new information with old information. Match collation. To help us develop a preliminary understanding. We don't actually see anything. I perceive him completely objectively, but in the brain, existing experience templates to understand him. When we see a circle, maybe think of a coin, a cookie, a basketball, and when we see the triangle, maybe think of the pyramids in Egypt, warning signs on the road. And when we see the square, it is possible to think of a cardboard floor tile. This is because humans have diagrams. This mental inertia. We are confronted with a new concept, often use existing experience to compare understanding. So, examples became our most effective teaching tool. It helps us navigate the divide between the known and the unknown. Build a bridge. Like pizza is like pie. Hamburgers are like Reggiano. Dumplings are like wontons in Italy. So these examples seem very reasonable. It's really easy for us to remember, but it is precisely because of this tradition what they are. These analogies are like using an old concept, cover up a new concept, rather than really understanding him. As Husserl once pointed out in the field of phenomenology, all consciousness is about something. The very fact that we see something. It's based on experience, on top of structural expectations and pre-understanding. For example, the cup we see now. In fact, this cup, it's our mental image of the cup, plus the constant confirmation of the senses. A construction in progress. Of course, we don't need to study phenomenology. Can also explain this. Now we can imagine. When a blonde European asks you, "Why do you Asians eat both used to branches? Isn't that primitive?" You're going to laugh. It's not a branch, but chopsticks. Do you dissect corpses like they do? Cut a bloody piece of meat with a knife and Isn't it primitive? Such cultural nuance jokes, very common in talk shows. In fact, on ourselves, there are many more such ridiculous behaviors. We just don't know it. Actually, when we take our past experience to explain someone else's world, it's so easy to turn curiosity into misreading, turn the analogy into a demeaning. Judgment evaluation. It is the first quality check of the human mind. When we are confronted with a message, a news, when evaluating, the brain automatically turns on the judgment system. Attempt to answer the following questions. Is that true? Is that believable? Does that make sense? Are there any biases? How do we know? It all depends on which system the brain is calling. According to Daniel Kahneman's two-system theory, when our brains think, it's basically two systems. System 1 is the quick intuition system. He is characterized by a fast start, conscious judgment. Usually, we call him effortlessly. He is mainly here to help us deal with familiar things in everyday life. For example, when we see our friends or colleagues, you can name them immediately. Or when we see the headline of a news article, make a judgment in your mind immediately. His strength is that he is efficient enough, but his weakness is that he is prone to making mistakes, vulnerable to emotional or biased misinterpretation. And system 2, it's a slow, rational system. He is characterized by deliberate slowness, but consciously makes some judgments. Usually we call him, it takes some effort. He's mainly here to help us deal with some of the relative complexities. Or an unfamiliar question. Let's say we evaluate an idea, the reliability of a statement, or research, investigate the deep reasons behind a certain phenomenon. His strength is that he can overturn prejudice, correction of errors, helps us make thoughtful judgments. But the drawbacks are obvious. It takes time and effort. It makes us tired. So in our daily life, in fact, most of the judgments and it's all driven by the system. System 2 is only called upon when necessary. Call out like, when you see one relatively complex social news events, you decide to conduct a rational analysis. So you turn on the computer to verify the information. Contrast the statement and call up the original text. At this moment, System 2 has been started. But that's where the problem comes in. Do you know what a chain of evidence is? Can you distinguish cause and effect from correlation? Are you familiar with logical wonders and common forms? Which ones do you recognize? The packaging of emotions. What are the facts themselves? You have received systematic logic training, or maybe more systematic critical thinking learning. If you even manage these most basic judgments, I don't have it. Not to mention the relevant knowledge base. So you're just using your reasoning in a very amateur fashion. Emotionally, this may be a difficult truth to accept, but we often pretend to be sentimental. Thinking is opening up reason. But here's the thing. Rational ability also ranks higher. Even if you call System 2, it doesn't mean you can necessarily judge right. System 2 is just an engine of reason. As for whether he ran well or not, it also depends on whether you have installed enough knowledge of fuel and thinking tools. And then there's stage 4. Questions the brain needs to answer. It's not true anymore. Is it true? It's what I'm supposed to do. Usually, we all think about our own decision-making process. It's a purely rational calculation. But the human decision-making mechanism is not driven by reason alone, but a value, risk motivation, the process of emotional polydetermination. They correspond to what you care about. What are you worried about losing? What kind of person do you want to be? How are you feeling right now? So the choices we make before every action, it seems to be operating rationally. It's actually reason plus emotion, a mix of character and cultural background, repeatedly pulling. That's why we all like to pursue some great personalities. Big man, because in the act of emotional involvement in decision-making, the smaller the proportion, the more likely we are. It's close to a rational decision. In this regard, Herbert Simon's an interesting concept was introduced. It's called bounded rationality. He believed that humans were not entirely rational, but in a state of limited information, limited time, under conditions of limited cognition, holding a almost enough attitude to make a decision. Although we are pursuing some so-called optimal sister, but actually, we often only find one. Subjectively think it's okay. For example, when we consider whether to change reason jobs, might tell you, the other company offers a higher salary, more room for growth. But at the same time you think, I feel very compatible with my current colleagues. The workflow is also very familiar. If you change to a new environment, may face more unknown risks. Or maybe, difficulty adapting to the new environment and the new pace of work. At some point, this anxiety will fully surface. Ultimately, it makes you feel more stable in your current job, rather than I need a new opportunity. So, we often think we've made a decision. But a lot of times it's your own personality, emotional fear. Experience is making decisions for us. And we are just that. The person who signs his name in the blank. So many times, it's not that we calculated and made a choice, but after the choice, recalculate the reason for yourself. See here, we have to admit, human thinking mechanism. It seems that there are many hard-to-fix bugs in nature. But we're not helpless. Because in the human thinking mechanism, there is also one of the easiest, overlooked corrections. He is original thinking. Original thinking. It's an easily overlooked part of the mind. He also tends to be a good thinker. Between ordinary people, the greatest watershed, so-called original thinking. It's the observation of our own thought processes. The ability to question and repair. Simply put, he's a man who thinks. Can he stop? Come down and ask yourself if I'm jumping to conclusions. Is this my idea? It's emotional. Do I have any evidence to support my judgment? Am I repeating a prejudice of the past? Thinking allows us to understand the world, but original thinking can help us avoid misunderstanding ourselves. Thinking is not a specific kind of knowledge. It's about consciousness. This awareness. Let's move beyond the first person of our thinking. Observe yourself in the third person. Psychologist Fravel once referred to him as knowledge about thinking. The true essence of critical thinking. It is this constant correction, the ability to correct one's own thinking path. Fravel in 1976. The two parts of the original thinking were formally proposed. He thinks the first part is the knowledge of the circle. You know what you know. Don't know what? You know what you are good at learning. You know what you are good at. We're not good at that. You are aware of the different tasks facing you. It requires a different strategy. Part 2, procognitive regulation. Can you think about your own thought process? Implement a real-time monitoring system. Can you determine whether your approach is effective? Can you make mistakes when they happen? Make timely adjustments. Can you do something after it's over? Expand self-reflection. It sounds easy, right? I'll give it to you. Proof of 4 leading figures in this field. In my previous 2 videos, I have introduced Einstein and Bohr's philosophical What's the fundamental difference? Newton and Leibniz. How did TZ independently invent calculus? How do they break out of an existing system? Fundamentally reframe the problem. And what are their base colors? Pushing them away subtly. I'm talking about, compared to their genius achievements, we should be more concerned. It's their powerful original thinking ability. And this, it's part of the learning process. Extremely easily obscured. We seem to have an easy time accepting one. The setting of geniuses and ordinary people. They can clearly know. Because they are geniuses, and I don't know. Just because I am an ordinary person. The gap between geniuses and ordinary people. Is it really the gap in Chile? In my opinion, the first gap is the gap in the way of thinking. When we face our own conclusions, are we bored to ask ourselves, what perspective am I using to look at the problem? Why do I start from this perspective? What's the premise of this hypothesis? Is he really necessary? Is that possible? Even the question itself is wrong. In recounting these leading scholars in history, I'm not trying to create something. The grand expectations of genius. Not to create a kind of genius. The sense of distance we cannot. The reason why I chose Einstein and Bohr, Newton and Leibniz. It is because of their theoretical development. There is a clear intersection, and it is through this intersection that we make a pair of observations. In order to disassemble their respective thought paths, I personally think learn a piece of shape thinking. It's not about improving your grades. Or maybe it caters to some kind of academic paradigm. Or think of it as a simple, the debate game, logic game. Our most fundamental goal. It is necessary to develop a structured approach. Reflective and even counterintuitive ways of thinking. Certainly, this all requires the help of a specific practice field to expand. So we need a concrete approach. Let this way of thinking can be landed and operated, trainable and applicable. And this specific method, it is the central tool of critical thinking, argument. Welcome to our argumentation section. First, I want to clear up a misunderstanding. Many people hear the word argument, think of a quarrel or an argument, even in our Chinese language. Okay, so what are you arguing about? The tone of the sentence itself is not very friendly. In fact, in critical thinking, argument, just to make the other party understand their own claims and reason and proceed on this basis, a structural tool for judgment, in order to facilitate everyone's difference between argument and We're going to start with a set of arguing dialogue scenes. I really think our company is disgusting. Overtime is always encouraged. Obviously exploitation. You have to pretend to be a corporate culture. How do you spread negative energy every day? You blame the company for your own poor performance. Why don't you start your own business? You work so hard to cleanse the capitalists. That's how you like empathy. Exploiters. Your 3 views are too wrong, right? You don't even know how the contract was signed. Who can blame but say you deserve it? In the dialogue scene just now we can see that this conversation is ostensibly discussing, does the company engage in exploitative behavior? But actually, the 2 sides did not propose any clear claims and reasons. All their conversation, it's all about venting emotions. Position attack. The purpose of the dialogue not about between the 2 parties. Is this company really exploitative? Behavior is suppressing the other. Actually, this conversation just has the voice over it. There is no room for rational judgment at all. The real demand of 2 people is to swear that I won, rather than what the truth is. Here we go again. Argument example. Let's take a look. What should be the conversational form of the argument? I think there is exploitative behavior in our company. Do you mean the salary is low, or working too long? It's not just about wages. Instead, management consciously exploits such as random layoffs during probation create the illusion of employee dereliction of duty to avoid legal procedures. These are not isolated cases. I have learned from multiple arbitration platforms a common pattern was discovered. It sounds like you do have a strong chain of evidence. But my question is this exploitative? Or just compliance but cold? They may not be breaking the law. So how do you determine that these behaviors constitute exploitation? You're right actually. Exploitation is not a purely legal concept. More prone to ethical judgment. And what I mean by exploitation is the exploitation mastered the absolute advantage in terms of system and leaving workers in asymmetric conditions, forced to accept unreasonable arrangements. At this point we can see a very clear proposition. And companies engage in exploitative behavior. In critical thinking, we demand that counterclaims be justified. In other words, making clear claims is not enough. You must provide a clear reason for this claim. And a reason given is, companies use institutional asymmetry to oppress employees, deprive them of the possibility to refuse and defend their rights. This is the reason rule in critical thinking. Of course, it's not enough to just give a good reason. This only proves a claim is not made for nothing. So under normal circumstances, reason rule, the principle of pairing with the burden of proof rule. In the conversation just now, we can also see clearly, while giving a reason, it also provides specific evidence to including layoffs, legal process control, arbitration data, etc. So let's move on. What was their conversation like? I have to. The definition you gave is really convincing, but according to your definition of exploitation, then college teachers work overtime, doctors work night shifts, paralegals are being squeezed. Does it also constitute a form of exploitation? Such a broad definition. Will you let this word? He lost his original sense of judgment. Is this a structural asymmetry? Or is it exploitation? Your question is crucial, and I admit that structural asymmetry is widespread. But do I think it constitutes exploitation? You can't just look at the structure. It depends on 2 conditions. First, do workers have a genuine right to choose? Is the system designed to be hidden, no appeal, hard to resist form? Okay, here we can see, in a statement, a very typical argument structure emerges. The claim he made was that the company was exploitative. The reason he gave was unequal institutional oppression for workers, deprivation of options and enforcement rights. His supporting evidence is the data of the arbitration, ambiguous terms of the contract, and the failure of the rights protection channel. Wait, do we need to consider, is the premise of your claim really valid? For example, employees don't have the right to choose. Is it possible that the employee just didn't read the contract, or the information judgment is wrong? Is that possible? What you see are just some extreme cases. It's not universal. After all, there are too many employees to manage. Labor disputes are normal, right? We can see it here. B presents a typical 100 million logic. He did not directly deny a conclusion per se. Instead, it starts to test whether the premises fail to hold. the legitimacy of that claim will naturally be undermined. And for A, this step is when building an argument, an essential challenge. We need to know, a good argument is not just about giving your own reasons. You also have to anticipate how others will question your claims. Okay, let's summarize. The basic structure that currently constitutes a good argument. What should it be like? Let's take the thesis of A as an example. We can see his claim. The reason, the evidence is clear. And the definition of the word exploitation. A response is exploitation. It's asymmetric oppression in an ethical structure, rather than a simple illegal act. And a premise of the argument. It is the lack of appeal channels for workers. Information is deliberately hidden. Of course, B also disputed his statement. B thinks it may just be a misjudgment by the employee, or some extreme cases. After all, a business is too big. A little labor dispute is normal. You can also imagine, if you, as a, how would you respond to what B means to you? Of course, my suggestion is I should be through multiple channels, conduct more case verification, extract more general data. This way, the case-by-case bias mentioned by B can be ruled out. I can understand your dissatisfaction with this company. Admit that your evidence does have a logical chain. What I want to ask is, your conclusion, derived from these individual cases, still inductive? That is to say, are you saying there are these cases, so corporations are structurally exploitative, or these cases? Suffice to say that the company has a certain tendency, and they're logically different, right? We can see, B is actually asking a key question. That is, what's your reasoning? In critical thinking, we distinguish between three main forms of reasoning. The first is called deductive reasoning. He went from general to specific. As long as the premise is true. A form of reasoning in which the conclusion necessarily holds. For example, all employees are oppressed by the system. Then Jong-san is an employee. Jong-san is being oppressed. His strength is structural secrecy, but the requirements for the premise are very high. The second is inductive reasoning. That is, from the individual to the general. Inferred from most cases. The overall trend reasoning approach. For example, the company has 10 cases of malicious layoffs. Then enough to prove the overall system of the company is problematic. But his weakness is, he can't guarantee that our conclusions must be true. And the third is reasoning by analogy. He put a structure, metaphorically, to another similar structure, and tried to convince each other. Like what? This company is like a casino that plays probability. Outsource employee risk. But his payoff is locked. This analogy, usually given our communication and writing, but he is also the weakest logically. B's rhetorical question is very tricky. Let's see how it responds. I see what you mean. My reasoning is mostly inductive. These cases are not isolated. They're highly stereotyped repetitions, and on multiple different employees, different time periods. It has even happened in the hands of different legal personnel. So, my contention is that not every employee is exploited. I think we should be talking about this. These models are highly stable within the corporate system. The best explanation for systemic sexual exploitation. In other words, among the many possible explanations, such as management negligence, individual supervisors, the employees themselves do not understand the law better than the company system. One-sided exploit the consensus of this interpretation. Concise and explains the most phenomena. We can see a response. It's a classic explanatory strategy. It's called the principle of maximum reasonable explanation. This is what we call the tolerant interpretation principle. He means that among the many possible explanations, we tend to choose the one that is clearest, the most complete version of all known phenomena. He may not be an absolutely correct version, but he is logical. It is the most acceptable to us. Here's a formal and clever application of this principle. Responded to B's question. He's not saying I'm necessarily right, but in saying that of all the current interpretations, my explanation is the most reasonable. Your current argument for exploitation basically has several layers. One is that you are stating the facts. For example, employee feedback on arbitration cases. This is a factual argument. The second is that you are proposing a causal relationship. How institutions lead to oppression. That's a causal argument. The third is that you add value judgments. These systems are unreasonable. This brings us to the value argument. So you use multiple types of arguments, rather than a single point of persuasion. Of course, I admit the fact itself, but the causality and value judgments you propose, not enough to convince me. B introduces a key concept here. It's the type of argument. In case-based thinking, we divide the types of arguments into several categories. Different types of arguments are suitable for different goals, and I'll just give you a quick list of 7 of them. The first type is the factual argument. He usually uses data, observing results to demonstrate that something actually happened. The second type is a definitive argument. When we argue about the definition of a word, for example, whether exploitation is valid or not, we need to use a definitive argument. The third type is the causal argument. He usually appears as A, resulting in B. For example, system design leads to employee oppression. The fourth type is the analogical argument. Use a familiar analogy. Another new topic. The fifth type is the comparative argument. He usually compares to phenomena to highlight the differences between one side and the other. The sixth is the argument of value. That is, to evaluate whether good or bad is just. The seventh type is the policy argument. When we discover a social phenomenon, we will use this form of argument to discuss what policies should we introduce, or what action to take. Are we for reform or resistance? We can see, in a process of arguing for exploitation, it actually uses the definition type at three types of arguments, causal and value. This makes his argument very strong, but it is also very easy to encounter challenges from others. How does it respond to these challenges? I agree with your analysis, and I also find that a lot of the time, people disagree because they can't figure it out. I am fighting the actual battle, or a war of values. Some people say that the company does obey the law. On the other hand, I feel that the company as a result, is unethical. Both parties always feel the reality of reason. They just mix different types of arguments. And that's exactly what we do when we judge an argument. The core question that must be asked, what are we talking about, is telling the truth, explain cause and defining effect, a concept or expressing a value position. If you don't even figure this out, then we are prone to mistakes, or fall into a kind of pseudo-theism. Then I have to confess a question. I'm actually worried. Your statement is easy to be misused. For example, as long as someone is He said I was being exploited. As long as you are not satisfied He said with the system manipulation or the oppression of the capitalists. Is this a generalization of the concept? This generalization, it's going to increase the risk of abuse. It's like breaking an argument. From one situation to the extreme, everything ends up being exploited. As long as there is subjective dissatisfaction, this so-called exploitation will never stop. Here, a very common logical trick must be mentioned. Landslide. Wonderful things usually assume a small change will inevitably lead to a series of extremes. Result, but he didn't provide reasonable explanation of intermediate steps. Like Bishop was worried about. As long as someone is subjectively concerned there about is dissatisfaction. That is exploitation. That is the exploitation of capitalism. So all our office workers, capitalism should be overthrown. This kind of argument, on the surface, it looks aggressive and powerful, but he lacks the intermediate chain of reasoning. It's completely illogical. This is the classic slippery slope fallacy. I agree not to slide, but my argument is not about incitement. It's not augmented. I am based on the searchable data structure pattern. It shows that the company has a systematic tendency. And I didn't say all industries and labor are exploitative. I'm just targeting this company. Verifiable behavior on these operations. Propose an evaluation. If we are afraid of being misused, we don't talk about structural injustice at all. That's not prudence. It's an escape. We are in a response. See the consciousness of a critical thinking ethic. First, he catches B's landslide alert, but he didn't flinch. Secondly, he clearly stated his chain of evidence. It's structured. It's not emotional. Finally, he used specific companies. Specific system. Concrete evidence begs the suspicion of these generalizations. In this short conversation today, we see, on B, demonstrate a high-quality critical argument. We can find out. They are in the process of arguing. There are clear claims and reasons. Clarify the structure of reasoning and not shy away from 100 million. They try to avoid errors in their reasoning. Maintain respect for each other's personality. This is the critical thinking course. The ability I most hope you can master. We're not trying to win arguments or during a conversation. He has the voice over him. But to present a position clearly, and always be ready to be tested by others. I believe that can help everyone master many specific courses on critical thinking knowledge, but our inquiry seems far from over. Let's go back to the dialogue. In the middle of the scene, then I'll ask the question from a different angle. Even if what you say is right, this kind of company, it is indeed subjectively and deliberately designed to make it difficult for employees to defend their rights. Ethical. But can we say, if this system makes companies more efficient, profit better, it can even increase the overall employment of society. Although he is not good, but it may be a necessary evil. In other words, if a system is immoral, but it brings better efficiency, is there any legitimacy for him to exist? This is a classic consequentialist ethical question. Use results to evaluate institutional legitimacy. If the system itself squeezes people, but the overall result got better, do we choose the outcome or the process? Your question is actually very realistic, but also dangerous, because once we accept efficiency can trump morality, that means as long as the price is not too great, structural injustice can be allowed. But I want to ask you a question. If you can benefit from the system, you just accept him. But if you are a victim of that system, Would you still see it that way? A truly legitimate system, it shouldn't come at the expense of some people, in exchange for a result that looks good overall. That's a good point. But some people, it is indeed voluntary to enter such a system. For example, many people are willing to join high-pressure
willing to
companies,
accept 996,
even actively embrace strong KPIs. So can we say they were exploited voluntarily? If they voluntarily accept asymmetry, is that exploitation? I guess you're right, they are contractually voluntary. But in reality, they face, maybe a chosen choice. Is it voluntary? You shouldn't just look at the moment of signing the contract. It's to see if you were actually told before that. Are there any options? Is there a safe exit mechanism? Otherwise we'll fall into that old saying. Of course you volunteered, because you accept promise. There is no choice. Hear you say that, and I did begin to doubt my own judgment. I always think rules are rules. Sign the contract and it counts. But now I'm starting to realize, even the person who signed the name, they don't really have a choice. Maybe we need a set of contracts and performance, more effective judgment criteria. That is, how do we treat the most vulnerable workers? In the conversation between A and B, we have witnessed a rare debate. There's no emotional confrontation, no accusations of merit. There are just well-structured claims, evidentiary doubt, and respond, of course. I have to admit, I designed these conversations. I just want you to be there. Learning in the environment and our critical thinking video series, it's far from over. In the next video, I will introduce the system to you. Common logical wonders in logic. To help you stay away from common mistakes in argumentation. I'm very grateful to be able to see the audience here. In fact, what we are discussing today, not just the specifics of flatbed thinking. It's not about exploitation. It's whether we're willing to admit it. This is the planet we live on. Some people are forever silent in the system, sacrificed, or by the default of our mainstream public. It's not important. Contracts are indeed the foundation on which modern societies operate. He made clear the responsibilities and provides a formal equality. But here's the real question. When the distribution of power is extremely uneven, formal equality itself, will it also become the coldest form of oppression? I've always felt that. Is a system legitimate? The most important test criteria. It was never his efficiency, not market returns. It's not a legal text. Not to mention how many crazy congestion and believers it's in response to a simpler question. When this system confronts the weak, how are they treated? Do you push them away or catch them? It's about listening to them, or gag their mouths. It is the sacrifice of acquiescence to this silence. Or are you willing to modify yourself to accept them? What we call an argument. Ultimately, it's not about winning an argument. It's not about getting higher grades. Not for a diploma. Like a monkey, performing academic performances hard in the ivory tower. It's about answering a more fundamental question. Can we make each other live with more dignity?